Sir, this lounge is for actual VIPs, not old men in army coats. The words left her lips like a knife quiet clipped. Before he could reply, she snapped her fingers at security. Elijah Voss didn't flinch. He simply stood, nodded once, and walked out into the cold rain. No protest, no demand. Just the same silent discipline that had carried him through a dozen battlefields. Inside, glasses clinked. Speeches echoed. No one noticed the empty seat, until the growl of tires shattered the stillness. Three black SUVs roared to a halt at the hotel entrance. A four-star general stepped out, eyes scanning the crowd before pointing at the vacant chair and saying, "Where is the man you just threw out?" And then just 5 words that made every face pale: "Pack your things. You're done." The envelope was thick-textured and sealed in gold. It stood out from the usual mail. Elijah Voss received a far cry from the pharmacy flyers and water bills stacked by his front door. He turned it over carefully, saw the letterhead Valor Night Gala, Belmont Grand Hotel. A hand-signed note accompanied it. "Mr. Voss, we are honored to invite you as a distinguished guest in recognition of your lifelong service. Your presence would mean the world to us." Elijah didn't much care for galas. He hadn't worn a tuxedo in decades, and the last time someone called him distinguished, it was a VA clerk trying to deny his benefits with a smile. Still, he knew what the event meant less for him and more for the ones who didn't make it back. That night he dressed with quiet care, pressed khakis, polished boots, a collared shirt faded at the shoulders. Over it, he shrugged on the one item that never gathered dust, a well-worn olive drab field jacket. There were no medals on it, just the threads and creases of memory, a jacket worn through fire dust and silence, the kind of thing that said everything without needing a single word. The Belmont Grand Hotel sparkled like a palace. Polished marble floors, chandeliers brighter than sunlight, valet drivers in black gloves. Elijah walked in alone, invitation in hand. Heads didn't turn, no cameras flashed. He moved quietly, respectfully, just as he always had. At the entrance to the VIP lounge, a young woman in a fitted blazer glanced up from her tablet. Her eyes scanned his jacket first, then his boots, then his weathered face. "Sir," she said crisply, "this area is reserved for confirmed VIP guests." Elijah held up the invitation. She barely glanced at it. "This must be a mistake. The VIP list is curated. Perhaps you're looking for the lobby seating area?" There was no hostility in her voice, just a polished condescension, the kind bred by expensive schools and structured training sessions on tone. She smiled the way people smile when they're trying to end a conversation without hearing the reply. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't explain who he was or what he had done. He simply gave her a short nod, folded the invitation back into its envelope, and stepped away. He had faced worse rejection than this in deserts and jungles, in quiet offices, with blank stares and silent clocks. A doorman's daughter once handed him a sandwich in Kandahar. That kindness mattered more than all the golden guest lists in the world. Elijah walked past glittering guests and waited by the lobby doors. He didn't fidget, didn't sigh. The rain outside hadn't started yet, but the cold breeze had crept in. Still, he stood calm and patient. Inside, they raised their glasses for heroes. Outside, one stood unseen. Elijah hadn't made it far before the tap came on his shoulder. The security guard, barely 30 and built like a linebacker, kept his voice low but firm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Elijah glanced back toward the lounge. The young hostess had already turned away back to her tablet, her face unreadable. He reached once more into his coat pocket and handed the guard the envelope, the invitation still crisp inside. The guard didn't even open it. "Ma'am says you don't have clearance. I'm just doing my job." That line, "just doing my job," Elijah had heard it before. From border checkpoint guards, from embassy workers, from junior officers who had never fired a shot but knew how to sign a denial form. He nodded, took the envelope back without a word, and followed. They didn't drag him out. That would have made a scene. No, they were trained better than that. Quiet removal, clean lines, professional courtesy masking a deeper offense. The hotel lobby was warm and gilded, a kind of manufactured elegance that didn't know what to do with a man like Elijah Voss. He stepped outside into the cold evening, the grand double doors closing behind him with a soft finality. The air was sharp now, rain misting just enough to stick to his shoulders. He stood still. Not because he was unsure of what to do next, but because that had always been his way. In the field movement, without purpose, got you killed. Here it merely got you ignored. Guests passed by without looking. Some offered awkward glances, unsure whether he was hotel staff or just a confused passerby. His presence didn't fit the narrative inside a gala full of tailored suits and silver spoons, polished for show. Then someone did look. A janitor, late 20s, pushing a floor buffer along the edge of the lobby windows, paused when his eyes met Elijah's. There was something familiar in the way the old man stood, weight-centered spine, straight, not defensive but ready, like he'd stood watch before. The janitor looked closer. His breath caught. He stepped away from the machine and walked to the glass, wiping it with a towel to be sure. Elijah caught the glance but said nothing. He simply gave the man the same nod he'd offered countless other soldiers, villagers, medics, children huddled in alleyways. The janitor pulled out his phone, dialed quickly. His voice was low but urgent, just above a whisper. "Yeah, it's him. He's here, standing outside." "No, no." He hasn't said a word. Then he hung up, tucked the phone away, and returned to his post like nothing had happened. Elijah remained by the entrance. The rain picked up, turning mist to drizzle, slicking the sidewalks and darkening the seams of his field jacket. Still, he didn't move. He hadn't been dismissed. He was waiting not for anyone in particular, but because he had come to keep a promise, and men like him never left early. Inside the Belmont Grand, the ballroom swelled with light and champagne. Polished wood floors reflected the warm glow of chandeliers, and rows of white linen tables were packed with men in expensive suits and women in pearl-draped gowns. Somewhere near the podium, a senator leaned toward the microphone, voice thick with practiced solemnity. "Tonight we gather to honor the heroes who gave this country their strength, their youth, their lives. We celebrate the brave, the loyal, the few." Applause followed, polite and precise, like it had been rehearsed. Meanwhile, just 30 feet away, Elijah Voss stood outside, unnoticed, forgotten, soaking wet. Each drop of rain traced a line down his weathered face. He hadn't moved since they let him out, didn't shift his stance, didn't glance at his watch. If the wind chilled him, he gave no sign. His hands stayed calmly folded in front of him, the way soldiers used to stand during memorial roll calls, like he was still present for something sacred, even if no one else understood. Inside, a banker clinked his wine glass with a lobbyist. A defense contractor smiled for a photo beside a congressman. They all talked about service, about sacrifice, about honor, but they hadn't seen it. Back at the edge of the hallway, behind a service cart stacked with silverware trays, the janitor watched Elijah through the foggy glass doors. He was no longer buffering floors. He was pacing now, thinking, remembering. His name was Carlos Medina, just 29. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before a roadside blast ended both his military career and his illusions about how veterans were treated. These days, he swept floors and kept to himself. But one image from a decade earlier was burned into his memory. A collapsed housing unit in Kandahar, screams buried under rubble, fire, confusion, and a soldier, broad-shouldered, calm-eyed, dragging men out one by one, dust-covered and relentless. The kind of soldier you never forget. Carlos blinked at the man in the rain. It was him. He fumbled for his phone and hit a number he hadn't used in years. It rang once before someone answered. "He's here," Carlos said, his voice low. "Elijah Voss, standing out front." And they threw him out like he was nothing. The line was quiet for a beat. "Understood," came the reply. Then the line went dead. Carlos pocketed the phone and stepped away from the window. He didn't go outside, didn't want to interrupt. Some men deserved to be seen exactly as they were, not helped, not fixed, just witnessed. Outside, Elijah remained motionless. His field jacket clung to him, now heavy with rain and memory. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He had long since stopped expecting recognition. But what he had never stopped doing, not for a single moment, was showing up. Because in his mind, the mission was never over. And tonight, it was personal. The night air was cut clean in half by the growl of engines. The tires of 3 matte black SUVs screeched against the curb outside the Belmont Grand Hotel, scattering rainwater across the street in a sharp spray. Their windows were tinted, bodies armored, movements surgical. The kind of arrival that sent valets scrambling and doormen stiffening. The first door opened before the vehicles had fully stopped. A tall, broad-shouldered man in full military dress uniform, stepped out, the ribbons on his chest gleaming beneath the street lamps, his 4 silver stars catching light like fire. His name was General Lawrence Braxton, and when he moved, even the pavement seemed to get out of the way. He didn't pause to adjust his coat. He didn't look around for fanfare. He walked straight through the rain. Guests turned. Security whispered. Someone reached for a radio, then thought better of it. General Braxton crossed the hotel entrance like a man on a mission. Inside the hotel, staff barely had time to react before the doors swung wide, and the cold followed him in. His boots echoed on the marble floor. His eyes scanned the room like radar until they locked on the VIP lounge, where a chair sat conspicuously empty amid a sea of chattering guests and untouched champagne. Then his voice dropped like a hammer. "Where is the man you just threw out?" The room fell silent. Laughter died. Wine glasses froze midair. The young hostess, who had earlier dismissed Elijah, blinked as if emerging from a dream. "I'm sorry, General. I was told he wasn't cleared." He didn't look like Braxton's tone sharpened. He stepped closer, his expression a masterclass in controlled fury. "You mean he wasn't wearing a $1,000 suit and a charity pin?" She stammered. "We didn't know who he was." "That's the problem," he snapped. "You didn't ask." Another staff member tried to intervene, an assistant event coordinator in a gold badge and tailored vest. "Sir, if there's been any misunderstanding," Braxton turned to face him. "This entire gala is the misunderstanding. If Sergeant Major Elijah Voss isn't inside this hotel, then neither am I. And if I'm not, then neither is the Pentagon's donation." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several corporate sponsors went visibly pale. Braxton didn't wait for permission. He pulled out his phone, pressed a contact, and said without ceremony, "Pull funding. We're relocating the entire event." The hotel manager appeared from the hallway, tie askew, clearly summoned in a panic. "General Braxton, sir, please. Let's not escalate." The general cut him off with a single glance. "You don't get to honor veterans with one hand and throw them into the rain with the other." Then he turned back to the young hostess and the nearby head of security, who had awkwardly stepped closer, unsure of where to stand. "As for the two of you, pack your things. You're done." The silence that followed was thunderous. Somewhere a champagne flute cracked against tile. No one cheered. No one clapped. This wasn't that kind of moment. This was a reckoning. From the far end of the lounge, a senator slowly set down his glass. A hedge fund executive whispered something to his aide. Even the event's MC, standing mid-stage preparing to introduce the next speaker, lowered the microphone and quietly stepped back. For the first time all evening, everyone was paying attention. And it wasn't to the podium or the donors or the glimmering wall of names behind the bar. It was to the chair that sat empty, and to the man who had come looking for its rightful occupant. The double doors creaked open again, this time from within. It was the hotel manager, sweat on his brow, tie hanging loosely around his collar. He rushed into the rain like a man running late to his own reckoning. "Elijah Voss," he called, voice half desperate, half repentant. "Sir, please, General Braxton is asking for you." Elijah turned slowly. He hadn't moved much in the last hour, but now as he straightened his shoulders and stepped forward, something about him shifted. Not visibly, not grandly, but unmistakably. He didn't look like a man returning to a gala. He looked like a man returning to finish what others had abandoned. "I don't want to cause any trouble," Elijah said quietly. The manager shook his head, his voice strained with panic. "Sir, with all due respect, the trouble's already here. The general says the event will not continue unless you're treated as the honored guest you were meant to be." Elijah studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. He stepped through the doors, not grandly, not dramatically, but with a calm that unsettled everyone he passed. His boots left faint wet prints on the tile floor. His soaked jacket clung to him like memory. Still, he walked without hesitation. A few guests near the lobby glanced up from their glasses. Some frowned. Others whispered. The ripple of recognition was slow at first. Someone mouthed, "Is that him?" Another leaned over to a colleague asking, "Didn't he?" But the name hadn't reached them yet, until the general stepped forward. In the center of the hotel lounge, under the soft white glow of the chandelier, General Lawrence Braxton came to attention. His spine straightened. His heels clicked. And then, without a word, he lifted his hand and delivered a perfect formal salute. Elijah returned it. Quiet. Precise. Nothing more needed to be said in that moment, but it said everything. The whispers grew louder. More heads turned. Guests began standing from their tables. Phones emerged slowly, not for spectacle, but in instinctive reverence. This wasn't the man they had expected when they heard honored guest. But now they could feel it, sense it. The hotel manager, still trailing behind, tried to explain himself. General, if I may, I assure you, we had no idea who he was. There was no profile submitted. No confirmation. Braxton didn't even turn. His voice when it came was like a steel door swinging shut. You don't need a biography to recognize dignity. You don't need a resume to treat a man with respect. He turned slightly now, fixing the manager with a glance that silenced him instantly. You need eyes, and you need humility. Clearly this establishment has neither. More guests stood now. The tension had shifted, not loud, not hostile, but palpable. People who had come to sip wine and applaud from a distance were beginning to realize they had missed something important. Not just a man, a message. Elijah kept walking. The crowd parted in front of him, not out of fear, but instinct. A natural formation like water moving around a rock. As he passed, words began to follow him. Soft, reverent. Delta Force, I think. Fallujah. He was there. Wait, wasn't he the one from Kandahar? It wasn't about medals. It wasn't about speeches. It was about a man who had walked away without protest and was now being walked back in with honor. And for the first time that night, the room no longer belonged to donors or dignitaries. It belonged to Elijah Voss. The ballroom was in full swing when the doors opened again. On stage, beneath a soaring arch of ceiling lights and velvet drapes, a corporate MC in a tailored tuxedo was midway through his speech. He was reading off a teleprompter with the confident rhythm of someone used to fundraising dinners and quarterly banquets. And of course, none of this evening's success would be possible without our generous partners in Logistics National Defense Initiatives and the incredible team at Westbridge Systems. He barely registered the movement near the back of the room. At first, no one did, but murmurs began to ripple through the audience, first as a trickle, then swelling like a tide. Guests turned their heads. Conversations froze mid-sentence. The air shifted in the room as if something heavy and undeniable had entered. General Braxton stepped through the grand ballroom doors, walking with unwavering purpose. Just behind him, slightly damp but upright, came Elijah Voss. Not in dress blues, not with medals, just his simple olive jacket still clinging to his shoulders from the rain, and a silence more powerful than any drumbeat. The MC stumbled for a second, catching the shift in the room. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could turn our attention, but it was too late. No spotlight needed. All eyes had already found him. And then in a moment that no one had orchestrated, the massive projection screen behind the stage, meant for sponsor, logos, and tribute montages, flickered. A technician backstage who'd been monitoring the live feed saw Elijah enter, recognized him, and without instruction cued a file he'd only meant to play at the very end of the night. A photograph filled the screen. It was black and white, grainy but unmistakable. A younger Elijah Voss face streaked with soot, uniform torn and dirty, carrying a wounded soldier through clouds of smoke and shattered concrete. One arm held the man over his shoulder. The other gripped a rifle. His jaw was clenched, eyes steady, utterly calm in the chaos. The caption beneath it read simply, Fallujah 2004. The silence was instant, total. The MC stepped back from the microphone, his mouth hanging open. Sponsors at the front table set down their glasses. Somewhere in the back, a woman let out a quiet gasp. Someone clapped once, then again, and then it surged. A wave of rising sound like thunder rolling in from the edge of a battlefield. Not the kind of applause reserved for polished speakers or polished boots, but the kind that came from recognition. Real, raw, long overdue. The entire ballroom rose to their feet. People who hadn't stood for a national anthem in years now stood for Elijah Voss. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply stood beside General Braxton, eyes scanning the crowd face. Unreadable, but the way he stood, there was pride in it. Not the loud chest-puff kind, the quiet kind. The kind that comes from carrying names in your heart long after they've been carved in stone. The general leaned in close voice, low but firm. It's your call now, Sergeant Major. Take the stage or not, it's up to you. Elijah paused. then stepped forward. The crowd parted as he walked, no fanfare, no dramatic music, just the natural hush of respect clearing a path. The microphone stood alone in the center of the stage, waiting. He reached it, glanced once at the glowing image still projected behind him, then looked down at his hands for a moment. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't come here tonight to be honored. I came because I was asked to stand for those who aren't here to stand for themselves." His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Every syllable landed like a stone in still water. There are veterans sleeping under bridges right now who've shown more courage before breakfast than most people do in a lifetime. And no, they're not always wearing suits. Sometimes they're just standing in the rain waiting to be seen. And with that, he stepped back. The ovation that followed was not a performance. It was the sound of an entire room finally seeing what had been in front of them all along. The applause faded slowly, reluctantly, as Elijah Voss stood at the edge of the stage. He didn't rush to the microphone. He didn't soak in the spotlight. He waited, letting the room settle, not just into silence, but into attention, the kind that can't be faked. When he finally stepped forward, the lights above him were soft, almost reverent. He looked out at the crowd, polished, powerful, influential. Then he looked past them, as if he was seeing someone else entirely. "I didn't come here tonight to be honored," he began, voice steady, deep, and unhurried. "I came because someone asked me to speak. Not for myself, for the ones who aren't here to speak for themselves." He paused. The microphone caught the silence. "Some men die once on a battlefield in an ambush in the line of duty. But some men, they die a little every day. When they're forgotten, when their names fade, when all that's left of their service is a form letter and a folded flag." A hush swept through the crowd. No glass clinking, no whispered side conversations. Just the weight of truth settling over everyone present. "You say you honor service," Elijah continued, "but too often we only honor what we can recognize. The uniform, the medals, the ceremony. But real respect that comes before the uniform. It shows up when there's no crowd, when no one's watching." He shifted slightly, glancing toward the back of the ballroom. "The young woman at the door didn't know who I was. That's all right, I didn't tell her. But the way she treated me, that said more than any speech you'll hear tonight. Not because she made a mistake, but because she didn't think it mattered." His tone never rose. He didn't accuse. He simply laid the truth out like a folded flag on a casket. Respect isn't a reaction, it's a principle. It's how we see someone when we don't yet know their story. A few heads bowed, not in shame but reflection. "You want to honor veterans," Elijah said, eyes scanning the room. "Then start by looking for the ones no one invites. The ones who don't show up in photo slideshows or sit at the head tables. The ones who still carry what they saw. The ones who don't need applause but need to be seen." He stepped back, his hand lightly touching the edge of the podium. "This night isn't about me," he said, his voice softer now. "It's about remembering what service really looks like and who we become when we forget." He nodded once to General Braxton, then walked away from the microphone without waiting for applause. But applause came anyway, not explosive, but building. Earned. Authentic. The kind that made people stand up without even realizing they were doing it. Because in 5 minutes, Elijah Voss didn't just remind the room who he was, he reminded them who they should be. The gala ended that night on a note no one had expected, not with celebrity speeches or champagne toasts, but with quiet conversations, tearful handshakes, and a line of people who waited patiently just to speak to Elijah Voss. Not for a selfie, not for a quote, just to thank him for his words, for his presence, for showing them what dignity truly looked like. But the real change began the next morning. By 9 a.m., the Belmont Grand Hotel released a formal statement, not just an apology, but a pledge. They announced the launch of a new internal program, Operation Frontline Respect, a mandatory training initiative for all customer-facing staff from bellhops to management. It would be led by veterans and designed to teach empathy, recognition, and the quiet signals of service often overlooked. Service isn't always seen in medals, the press release read. It's seen in posture, in patience, in silence. Surprisingly, the young hostess and the security guard who had escorted Elijah out were not terminated after all. While General Braxton had dismissed them in the heat of the moment, Elijah, ever steady, ever thoughtful, requested otherwise. 2 days after the event, he called the hotel director privately. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said. Even I got one once in Fallujah when the order came to leave men behind, and I didn't. He offered a solution: refer both the hostess and the guard to a local veteran transition center run by a friend of his, a retired corpsman named Theo Marshall. The center offered intensive training in veteran support, trauma awareness, and public service professionalism. They accepted, at first out of guilt, but over time out of gratitude. 6 months later, both returned to the Belmont, not as staff, but as guest instructors during the rollout of the hotel group's new national initiative, Honor Without Uniform. What had started as one man's quiet stand in the rain became a movement. Hotels across the country began adopting similar programs. Some launched veteran hiring pipelines. Others removed VIP-only labels entirely from certain events, opening them to former service members of all ranks and backgrounds, suit or no-suit medals or none. The gala itself was permanently renamed. No longer Valor Night. Now it was called Honor Without Uniform, a tribute to the seen and unseen. The next year's event took place in 3 cities, simultaneously live-streamed nationwide. And this time, the first people greeted at the door weren't celebrities or donors. They were the veterans who had RSVP'd without a title beside their name. Elijah Voss was there again, of course. Not on the stage, not even seated near it. He stood quietly at the back next to the janitor who'd made the call. They didn't need to say much. The work was speaking now, and the world was finally starting to listen. 6 months passed. The rain had long since dried. The applause faded into memory, and Elijah Voss had returned to the quiet rhythm of his life: morning walks, folded newspapers, a garden in need of constant weeding. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't expect invitations. But one afternoon, a knock came at his door, hand-delivered not by courier, but by a woman in a blazer and boots that still bore the discipline of the military. She introduced herself: Claire Jennings, newly appointed Director of Veteran Relations at the Belmont Group. A former Marine, sharp-eyed and composed, but with a softness behind her words that only came from experience. "We're doing it differently this time," she said, holding out the envelope. "No champagne, no black ties, no stage lights." Elijah opened it and read the card inside: Honor Without Uniform Community Forum on Homeless Veterans, Mental Health and Service After Service. Your insight matters. Please advise us. He looked up. "Advising?" he asked with a faint smile. Claire nodded. "We're not asking you to attend. We're asking you to guide." Elijah Voss returned to the Belmont Grand a week later, not walking in through the service doors, not standing in the rain. This time he was greeted at the entrance by a row of volunteers in plain clothes, half of them veterans. The rest civilians trained to recognize what most overlooked. Inside, the grand ballroom had been stripped of pretense. Folding chairs replaced banquet tables. Backpacks lined the walls, each packed with hygiene kits, jackets, and boots. A pop-up clinic stood near the buffet offering flu shots, PTSD counseling, and VA claim assistance. The people who filled the room weren't dressed for gala photos. They were veterans on the margins, many with no fixed address, some silent, some shaky, others just lost. And they were finally being seen. At the front of one breakout session stood 2 familiar faces: the young hostess and the hotel security guard who once turned Elijah away. But now they were leading a workshop titled Recognition Without Assumptions: How to Greet with Dignity. They had completed the Veteran Center program, stayed on as mentors, and now ran Honor Without Uniform trainings across 3 states. Their tone was humble, their stories honest. And when they spoke of the mistake they once made, they didn't make excuses. They made space for learning. During a quiet moment near the exit, a small group approached Elijah. Former soldiers, men and women, still carrying the weight of war on their shoulders. One of them, a young man with a duffel bag and sunken eyes, said simply, "I didn't think anyone cared." Elijah looked him in the eye. "We do now." At the close of the evening, as the volunteers packed up and the fluorescent lights hummed above them, someone asked Elijah if he had anything he wanted to say, a quote maybe for the program brochure. He thought for a long moment, then said quietly, "Respect doesn't need a uniform, but it notices who gives it." He handed them the quote, shook their hand, and walked out the same doors he once stood outside, no longer unseen. He had not returned for recognition. He had returned to make sure no one else waited in the rain. In today's fast-moving world where so much is judged by appearance, status, or what someone seems to be, Elijah Voss's story reminds us of a quiet truth: real worth isn't worn, it's lived. He never asked for recognition. He never demanded honor. Yet by standing in silence, soaked in rain, overlooked, unbothered, he revealed more dignity than any uniform or medal could display. And when the world finally noticed, it wasn't because of what he said, but because of how he carried himself. There's a lesson here for all of us, especially in a society where we often rush past the elderly man at the store or the woman sitting quietly alone in the cafe. What stories are we missing? What sacrifices are we walking past? More importantly, when no one's watching, do we still choose respect? If you've ever experienced a moment where someone looked past you, or maybe harder to admit where you looked past someone else, share it in the comments. What did you learn from that moment? What would you do differently now? Thank you for spending time with us and for honoring the quiet heroes who walk among us. If this story moved you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who may need this reminder. And remember, not all heroes need to speak to be heard. Sometimes they just need someone willing to see beyond the surface. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, be kind, be present, and above all, never assume silence means someone is ordinary.